Hey everyone, this is Anatoly, and you guys are watching us do a Twitch stream on gaming for the Ignition Hackathon. So one of the coolest folks in gaming and crypto is joining us, Josh from Forte. Um, Awesome for you to be here. Want to love to know your origin story, how you got into crypto, how you got into gaming.
Yeah, sure. It's nice to be here. I'll always love when I get a chance to talk with you, totally. So thanks for lining this up. Yeah, at Forte, we're trying to help pull the future forward with blockchain games. And for me, I've been in games for a long time, and before that, I was in fintech actually. So it's kind of a good combo of the two things. And been working with and playing around with researching sort of blockchain technology for 6 or 7 years, and we started Forte about 4 years ago. So yeah, for me, the idea was I got into games because, like, as a kid, I was a nerd and loved math, and when I got it, I saved up my newspaper route money to buy a computer at like a 286, which was like old when at the time, and wanted to make games, and so I like taught myself programming. I think it's a common story. And anyway, so that's how I got into it, and then got lucky, meeting cool people and kind of getting into games and building some cool companies. And yeah, actually, it's like kind of stumbled my way into startups and fintech before that.
I shoveled snow in Chicago. And
Safe.
I got a 75 megahertz like Pentium with like Windows 95 on it.
Yeah, yeah.
It's funny.
Yeah. When you were first starting out, how did you like, what did you first learn to code on? Like, what languages were you messing with?
C was like the language was the first one that I started coding in. And we had like a class in high school,
Yeah,
which
nice.
all it was optional, so although it was just the nerds.
Yeah, yeah, totally. Yeah, it's
And
awesome.
Borland, I think the Borland compiler is what we
Turbo
had.
C++, plus plus, yeah.
Yeah.
Turbo C, yeah, nice. Yeah, awesome.
My first experience with a game was we had this assignment to build an AI for like it was Snake, right? But basically we called it Tron, where you like create a
Oh yeah,
line and you
oh yeah,
gotta.
yeah, totally.
But the teacher made it like a versus game, so your algorithm to detect where the other
Oh,
snake
that is
was ran against the other one,
oh,
and
that is awesome.
yeah, I built like a greedy one that always ran away from like pick whatever most the open space was that worked really well. And that was like the first time I had like this like eureka moment. Oh, okay. This is like AI environment
Yeah,
gaming. Like it's just like I can observe the world in this like very weird way and
totally.
then take action.
Yeah, that's so awesome. That's super cool.
Yeah, that like loop, right? You like how if you ever like build a game, like there's always like an event loop that you
Yeah.
discover, and
Hmm.
it's so weird to think of it as like one detecting one photon and then taking action on it in this
Yep.
incremental way. Just do it fast enough, it looks real.
Yeah, totally, man. Totally. Yeah, that's right. That's right. And then for you, I mean, like, how'd you go from that to blockchain? I know you spent a lot of time at Qualcomm and
Yeah,
doing like
yeah,
real low
yeah,
level work.
yeah.
Yeah.
Well, sure. Well, this is supposed to be your origin story,
All
but like,
right.
we'll
Yeah.
do mine. I ended up kind of being a nerd in high school and like hanging out with folks. We started building Linux from scratch and like messing around with operating systems. And I got into college, and because I already knew kind of how to code, I
Yeah.
skipped some classes, the entry ones, and went straight into the kind of the mid level like classes and started working on a startup to do voice over IP.
Hmm.
Like, what if we connected like old school phone lines and like build like stuff around it? But
Yeah.
unfortunately, no business sense. I didn't realize that you could just say, this is now in the web and is global and raise a bunch of money.
Right.
We were trying to like build like boxes and bootstrap it, and .com crash wiped like all semblance of being able to do that for real.
No doubt.
Um, but Qualcomm was using the same stack to go build their voice therapy stuff, so got hired. and ended up just like geeking out on instruction sets for ARM and cycles and making stuff faster. And
Yeah,
actually, like, yeah, my second experience with gaming was like on Brew, which is the first mobile platform.
totally.
And getting the Blit engine, the 2D Blit engine to work with alpha blending,
Yep.
optimizing that
Yeah,
thing. That
yeah,
was,
yeah, yeah. Yeah,
yeah.
totally.
Like,
That's awesome, man. That's really cool. Yeah. Well, yeah, VoIP and kind of the signal processing, broadcasting data, like,
yeah.
pretty direct path there
Yeah.
to today. Yeah, it's
Yeah.
awesome.
So,
Yeah.
but when like the blockchain boom happened, I was like, oh yeah, this is a resource constrained operating system, kind of like a flip phone in the 90s. I
I
can do
know this. Yeah.
this.
Yeah, I know this stuff. Yeah, totally. Awesome. Awesome. Yeah, for me, I dinked around with programming in high school. I got to work at my school district and like do a bunch of programming stuff and figure out some like, I don't know, all kinds of things. It's like the early days of computers, being deployed like broadly in like IT systems and stuff. And so like, I don't know, everything from like, how should we route buses, to pick up kids for field trips is, trying to write programs for that. Similarly, you write like a greedy algorithm. And even though you didn't know that was what it was called at the time, you're just like, it's the only thing that works, and then, and yeah, I kind of stumbled my way into, I didn't know what startups were. I didn't grow up in the Silicon Valley or anything, but ended up creating a company that did fintech. I was super into math as a kid, and for some reason I was into like stocks. And even though we had like no money or anything, or just was love to read about it, and I ended up meeting this guy. We ended up forming a company together that basically was like early in fintech and like in the digitization of financial data streams and like making those available on the internet. And so we created a company that basically sold like data streams with automated pricing recommendations around like mispriced options and stuff. So we sold to like market makers, institutional investors, hedge funds, and it kind of grew it big. But it was crazy because there was no distributed computing anything at the time. So to process like these big sets of data, we were daisy chaining like motherboards together by their serial ports and writing assembly and trying to make things perform. And so
That's awesome.
so it was cool.
That's,
Yeah. So
yeah.
and then from there, I got super burnt out. Actually, like I sort of didn't know if I was doing anything like that worthwhile or meaningful. Actually, when I got my head wrapped around it, it was a good business. But yeah, I just kind of want to always make games and got involved with these guys who made a bunch of games that I loved playing when I was a kid, and they were forming this company, and I joined and became CEO and CTO of that too, and it was called Garage Games, and we were all about like enabling indie game developers, like small game developers, in like the early 2000s, like 2002, 2003, right when games were kind of going from this like very, I guess, like in blockchain parlance, centralized industry with like 12 publishers around the world that like controlled all the retail distribution, and games were kind of stagnating, like a bunch of sequels and whatever. And so the thought was, hey, like the internet, like you could just directly distribute games to users and to players, and actually if we could just like give people technology, give them like a game engine, a way for them to more easily build games, then like kind of could get games back to only takes 3, 4, 5, maybe 10 people to build a cool game. And so so we kind of built an engine to do that.
I feel like we were so close to like an internet-based platform at that time,
Totally,
and then
man.
like mobile happened and like ruined everything. And I mean, I helped mobile happen.
Yeah, that's right.
I didn't realize at the time that like it was just going to be such a lock-in system.
Yeah, I guess that's the bummer thing. I mean, and one of the cool things about blockchain is like, I guess like Web 1 and 2 has been, we create these open protocols and open standards, which is great, but there's no economics associated with it. And so you get these network effect cycles kick in, and they're broadly distributed. And what that ends up resulting in is people can sort of leverage the network effects and build a network that's highly, entrenched, and then start extracting value from it. And so, what's cool about blockchain stuff is it's like a a way to associate value with an open protocol, and then socialize costs, socialize benefits, and like I don't know. That's for me. That's part of what was cool about blockchain in general. And then games and blockchain was just if you want blockchains to sort of be a big part of the future and for that to happen as soon as possible, then games are just such a natural fit for it. Because like one, there's 3 billion people that play games around the world. It's the largest kind of consumer category besides social media and instant messaging, and it's the only one that isn't totally locked up by a bunch of monopolies basically. And then also just the consumer, like player behavior makes sense. Like most players already buy virtual goods and virtual currencies, and so kind of like the mental model shift is just super tiny to hop from what players already do in games today to like, oh, I'm doing the same thing. I'm buying virtual currencies, I'm buying virtual goods, but now I just actually own them, and like maybe there's an open market around them. So that was for me like several years ago, sort of the thought between like behind wanted to do Forte and make it happen. And like 6 or 7 years ago, we were just doing research on, is this ever going to be scalable at real mass market with like tens of millions, hundreds of millions, hopefully billions of users? How far away is that? And we thought, about 4 years ago, we thought, okay, it's on the horizon, and in 3, 4, 5 years, it'll be right there. And I think that's like roughly right. We're getting there. So yeah.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. That's awesome. I love, man, everybody in the space right now, I think is because they ran up to an intermediary that sucked.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah. For me, it was actually trading. I also got into like stocks and numbers, like, cause I'm a math guy, engineer, and there's like this temptation to build like a money machine.
Right.
Like if I can like track all these patterns and stuff, but when you start doing it, you realize that in traditional finance, there's 10 people between you and where the market, and
right.
they all want to take a little bit, and then you get nothing.
That's right, man. Yeah, and that problem's just got worse and worse, with time. So, yeah, I thought it would be cool. I mean, whatever you want to talk about, but just for maybe folks that are interested in games and game developers that might tune into this, now or later. I thought it'd be interesting to talk some more about Solana and maybe some of the technicals, behind it. At Forte, we're trying to make it easy for game developers who maybe already have existing games, existing player bases, or developers who are interested in creating new games, to just leverage blockchain technology and create like good player experiences that just kind of work out of the box and like get them to really scale. And so, I think it's good for developers to wrap their heads around how the underlying kind of back-end systems, basically like the data stores and the low-level kind of user-defined functions for blockchain smart contracts can work. And our view is like each there's some blockchains that just kind of don't have a reason to exist. Maybe they're copycatting things. Maybe they don't they don't have any sort of fundamental technology or the big differentiators. But then there is this big space of sort of protocol definition and fundamental architectural trade-offs that you make when you're defining a blockchain protocol. And the idea of the protocol is, look, we have an open database that's permissionless, and it's got safety. So like every transaction is valid or is validated, and some semblance of liveness, like every valid transaction gets included. And so that's awesome. It actually was a dream for a long time in distributed computing. How do you have a big open database? And the idea with games is cool. You can put some of your items, some of your economy in this big open database that opens up maybe a market around it. It gives players ownership. But like, how do you implement that? There's a bunch of trade-off dimensions to think about. And I think you did an awesome job thinking about things in Solana from first principles and sort of looking at like, okay, we want to have a single sharded system so that data is highly available to all the user-defined functions, and we have sort of a good, like a low-level programmer sort of view of resource allocation and management, and deploying code like ELFs to LLVM and whatever. So if you could walk through that, would be cool.
Yeah. So it really kind of starts from the physical layer, right? Like almost from the silicon itself. You only have so
Yeah.
much space in that chip.
Yeah.
And when you look at something like an ARM processor for like normal programs, by normal I mean programs that take a lot of branches and have a lot of state dependencies. Hey,
Yeah.
like I may read this address, I may read this register to get an address to go pull up a new place to jump to, and that
Right.
may change every time I read it because of how the program operates, and that means it's unpredictable and it's really hard to optimize that code.
Yep.
So that is like what your CPU does. But what's interesting is that GPUs are far more computationally efficient for the amount of space that they get, but that's because the programs are structured such that everything is known ahead of time. So you
Yes.
tell this thing, okay, you don't need to decode these addresses dynamically. Here are all the addresses I'm going to read, and they're
Hmm.
layered in a row. And you know that you can start prefetching and doing all the stuff. And then the code that's operating across all these memory cells, that never changes. It's the
Yes.
static code that just churns through this. So that really was baked into my head from working on ARM and DSPs and like GPUs at Qualcomm. And I
Yeah.
kind of know just those trade-offs at this point instinctively. I can like almost visualize the area that this is
Yeah.
going to take on the chip.
Yeah. 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 Totally.
So when you get to that point, and like I saw this thing as a very constrained environment. Like you only have one blockchain, one supercomputer, and if you shard it, especially if I was coming from finance, you're creating arbitrage and different markets. And that
Hmm.
obviously has some advantages. You shard it and now you have different markets, but there's an obvious advantage. What if you only had one giant marketplace
Yep.
without any sharding?
Yeah.
That thing should actually have better pricing for the world. So how do we build that thing?
Yeah.
So it started really from that perspective and decided to, well, if we have this one massive supercomputer that everyone's using, then you got to start from the most efficient kind of computational environment. And this is this really kind of hard to program constrained like runtime where you have a code that is static, right? So you write it once, it doesn't have any state. So it's
Hmm.
just pure bytecode. And then it operates over memory that is predefined. So it's known ahead of time. And this is where a transaction format comes from, where each
Yeah.
transaction knows which memory is going to read, which memory is going to write.
Yep.
Once you have that, then it's easy to optimize and parallelize. And I think, like you said, when is this stuff going to be really fast? I think probably within 4 years, you're going to see like a very boring looking Solana box that sits next to your Cisco switch. And it's the thing that like maybe you plug in storage because that's kind of easy to scale that,
Mhm.
but like that's the thing that runs the protocol, just moves packets in and out as fast as it can.
Totally. Totally. Yeah. And I think, one of the things, all blockchains today, but you guys did a really good job optimizing for is basically how to make writes, efficient. The read, layer is sort of a totally
That's
different
a hard problem.
problem. Yeah. So it's a
We're
hard
giving that
problem.
problem to you.
Exactly. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. So we try to help with. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, yeah, yeah. But it comes down to the way you described it, right? Like if you're gonna make reads efficient, then you need to understand like what is memory layout, and for me, what's part of the reason to kind of dive into this level of detail is game developers, at least in the old days, but even still with a lot of game engines and middleware, have to be super familiar with this stuff. Like games are really hard software to write actually. Like games today have all the kind of like web scale problems, cloud computing, distributed computing, things, but also you have this like really fat client in many games, even like mobile games, where you got to do like rendering and physics simulation. And besides like all the software complexity, and it's got to work like often in real time around the world. And so you got a lot of networking, and how do you actually have really consensus, between a server and a bunch of different clients. And um, it's tough. But besides that, like it's got to be fun, and there's a bunch of art, so it's just hard stuff to build. And I think it's great as game developers look more and more at blockchain to understand some of the fundamental sort of trade-offs of the underlying L1s.
Yeah, this is I think like people when they ask me like could you run like Twitter on top of a blockchain? The answer is
Right.
both yes and no.
Right.
Because sure, we can like handle 5,000 writes per second.
Yeah.
But like you still need to build all the exact same infra that Twitter builds to
To
disable the
cache and
reads, to
totally. Yeah.
cache, to structure the visual representation of that data, to
Totally.
actually make it like useful. And like that part is probably, I would honestly say that like if you were going to build Twitter right now, you'd probably use a right optimized like queue, like Solana or Kafka, that's has high
Totally.
consistency and availability, and then you do all the same stuff that Twitter does anyway. So
That's right.
the cost is the same.
Yeah, that's right. And I think it's, I don't think a lot of developers in general, like Web2 developers or game developers, understand that today, but it's actually a pretty simple, from a tech perspective, pretty simple mental model shift to make. And but then you get all this exogenous benefit from kind of making that leap. And now things are, using this open protocol in an open network, and that enables you to do things like let people own whatever you want to call them, but tokens and virtual currencies, virtual goods, and have like an open market around those things.
Yeah. What I really like, I think that's really unique is the cryptography aspect of it, that
Yeah.
you can actually like people with cryptography, right? They can just coordinate using that as their identity. You as a developer, you kind of start to abstract the account and human out of it, and you're just like, don't stop caring about the like tracking a person, because fine, use whatever public key you want. Doesn't really matter how many accounts you create, right?
Yeah.
Like everything ends up being identified through this opaque thing, which I think makes designing like social networks and gaming environments, I think, a lot easier.
Totally. I think that's right. And maybe that ties to some of the sort of consensus trade-offs that different and the different guarantees that different blockchains make too. The sort of fundamental innovation with Bitcoin initially with proof of work was in order to solve like Sybil attacks, right? You basically introduce a cost to try to write to the database or to propose a block, and so that means like you don't change anything about like the old impossibility proofs around consensus in distributed permissionless systems, but you do basically get a game theoretic guarantee about consensus in these systems. And then I think kind of jumping off from Bitcoin, there's now proof of stake systems, and Solana's got a version of that, along with really some innovative stuff around essentially VDFs and like ways to timestamp with proof of history and stuff. So maybe if you could talk about that. Like, I love that you guys think we agree with this. Obviously, so I'm biased, but I think like there's a multi-chain sort of world, at least for the foreseeable future, and so yeah, I mean, if you could talk about that layer of it too, I think it'd be helpful for developers to understand.
Yeah, the cool thing, what's really different about Solana is it's a real-time system.
Yeah.
And that, again, probably because I spent a career at Qualcomm, this is how I think of the world is, and real-time actually depends on a consistent time source for all the participants that are activating their actions in a particular cycle, right? In a particular signal shift or a clock cycle. And this is really easy to do in like normal wireless networking, because the FCC says that if you don't comply with the protocol, they'll literally send a van out to shut you down.
Right.
So we don't have any vans. So so how do we do? Yeah, it's a little harder, but we have cryptography, and that's the really cool thing. So when I had my eureka moment, in 2017, I had like this, 2 coffees and a beer, as the legend goes. And I couldn't sleep, because what I realized was that there's a way to encode passage of time as a data structure. And if you've ever studied math and physics, you know that there is no mathematical representation of time, right? There's no way to encode and say, this is the arrow of time. And it's such a kind of core problem that I just really couldn't sleep for like a week. And I couldn't find anybody else working on this stuff, because I just didn't know what to Google for. I Googled for a bunch of things and couldn't find it. But like, Dan Bonet and a bunch of other folks have been working on VDFs forever. And there's these things called RSA time locks. And I think I would have found these amazing people at that time, I probably wouldn't have started Solana, because I was like, oh, I don't have anything new. There's already already people that are like generations ahead of me on like really hardcore cryptography. So that that was like just some luck that like kind of,
The Google
shoved me
foo failed.
that,
Yeah.
yeah, the Google failed enough to where it shoved me out the door. And once I kind of had the pressure to like, okay, what am I actually going to do and build, started talking to my buddies from Qualcomm, and it just kind of became obvious that our experience in building high performance systems and protocols is really like unique to the space, that there
Yeah.
were really no other teams that had that kind of background. So we decided to go for it. And the protocol kind of came out, it's really hard to design this stuff like in a week, right? So it took like solid 2 years for us to get to a BFT solution.
Yep.
We thought it was gonna get it done in a year, but
Right.
literally engineering
Yeah.
timelines.
Times two is pretty good,
Yeah,
man. That's pretty
yeah,
good. Yeah.
yeah. And we realized what became clear is that source of time is what it is really important in these systems is in selecting who gets to produce a block when.
Yeah.
And if you go back to radio, you should remember that two radio towers to transmit signal at the same time or the same frequency, you get noise because that signal interferes.
Yep.
Same problem as two block producers to produce a block at the same time. You get a fork. And now that's interference for the entire network, logically, right? So if you could alternate them by time, if there was some way to force them to go one at a time.
A gap, yeah.
Yeah. That's effectively what that VDF provides, is that when we create this leader schedule, instead of using this random puzzle solver that proof of work is, there's a deterministic solver, but it deterministically forces everybody to solve it in a particular delay. So that's really trick that the network does with VDFs.
Yeah, it's awesome.
And like, I think we can, right now that's set to 400 milliseconds. As we're optimizing, it's becoming clear that I think it can be done at 200. And then probably every 10 milliseconds after that is going to be some blood, sweat, and tears. But it really feels like we can get to, the time it takes for information to travel halfway around the world, right, is about 120 milliseconds.
You can kind of get there. That's the theoretical limit, basically. Yeah, totally. So totally makes sense.
That would be super cool. That would really be a system where state transitions through this like single global supercomputer travel at the speed of news.
Yeah,
and
that's right.
Then information in this supercomputer is as good as any other market outside of it.
That's right. In tying back to what you said earlier, what we talked about, because it's single sharded, like all that news gets to everyone at the same time, if you're paying attention at least. And, everyone who's participating in the transformations or the market or whatever.
Nobody has any advantage.
Yeah.
All you need is hardware to plug in. Even if that hardware costs $5,000 a year, 10,000 a year, it's a lot cheaper than what CME charges for data, what anybody else charges for data. 1,000 times cheaper.
Totally. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And there's not a kind of monopoly intermediary, right? So besides whatever they choose to charge for rent today, it could be different tomorrow, and that's like a more fundamental type of problem.
And they choose who gets to even pay them, and that is like the core part of it. Was that like, as a hobbyist, I couldn't get access. Like there was no like student like rate that they're like, go mess around and see what you build.
Totally.
They do not have that attitude at all, which is like
it's very gated. Totally. Yeah, it's awesome to walk through that stuff, man. And again, I think it's so games are I feel like really adjacent to the blockchain technology space, even though a lot of game developers today don't actually fully realize that. Like when they dig in, listen to you talk and dig into the technology, I think it becomes more and more clear. Like even things like proof of work and the denial of service mitigation, right? Like that, there was games actually adopted. I guess back in the day it was client puzzles. Basically, it was like RE Joules and you guys use BPF, right? Berkeley Protocol format, and so much good stuff came out of Berkeley. I think Ari was at like a postdoc at Berkeley at the time. Came up with client puzzles, which actually we adopted at Garage Games pretty early on to basically do things for like real time games where gamers will find like every way to like hack a system and exploit or whatever. Like a common thing that would happen in the early days of like multiplayer gaming is someone would be in a competitive match and like maybe get behind and they're like a little bit tech savvy and they would just like blow up the server by opening up too many connections and it's like sort of the match would end. They wouldn't have a loss on their record. It's like it sucks, but like it would happen all the time. So you sort of see the research from academia with client puzzles and denial of service attack mitigation, and so you can introduce that into the game before you form a connection. You got to reverse the hash. You do a little client puzzle, and like, okay, cool. It's a mitigative step. It doesn't like fully solve it, but like now that guy who doesn't want to lose the match has to actually like spin up a bunch of CPU somewhere, pay some money, and like probably is not going to do it. And so I think games sort of think about consensus, denial of service attacks, like what is actually a valid state for a pretty complex set of states and state transitions a lot. And so it's just so analogous to sort of the problems you and others have had to solve in the blockchain space.
Yep. Yeah. It is very similar. Like, and it's this problem of Sybil resistance. Social networks have to deal with this all the time.
Right.
Do you think like gaming as it evolves, like especially with crypto, is going to be more of a like social experience first?
Yeah.
Like an individual like one?
I definitely do. I mean, I think broadly that's happening in games, already, and even in largely single player games, like, popular ones like Animal Crossing or something. It's mostly like you play on your own, you manage this little virtual island and you customize it and you get stuff in the game. But like, you can introduce these social layers where people can like go check out your island, you check out theirs, and like it sort of becomes social. And then, what's cool about these systems, we wrote some pieces on this, but like anytime you get people together socially, like they end up actually wanting to trade with each other. It's just like a human thing. Like even when you don't have like money or a concept of that, right? You just like sort of end up trading favors. Like, hey, could you watch my kid? And then like, I'll watch yours later or whatever, So people want to trade. And like that happens even in these mostly single player games today, when there's even a little bit of a social layer, like a way for people to interconnect. And even when the game like explicitly pushes out, like you can't trade with, there's no way to trade with, with people, or, there's no real money involved or whatever. And it's actually against the terms of service of the game or whatever. People still want to trade and still want to trade with some real money. And so like these sort of gray markets and black markets emerge. And there's one in there's one in that game called Nukazon. And it's like, people basically like go weed each other's islands, and like create little small businesses to do that. So anyways, I guess long-winded answer to like, yeah, definitely. I think games would get more social in general. And then like, definitely when there's a semblance of, I have an identity I can carry across, games, and I can be pseudonymous, if I want to, if I choose to, or not. And then there's like a market economy, kind of like property rights where people own stuff in games and can trade goods and services with each other. Like definitely, games will get more and more social, and like sort of as players come to want to really own stuff and trade with each other, I think they're going to demand more and more like guarantees of their property rights, which sort of necessitates that all of their properties sit in one central database, like it's in an open ledger. And so that's where, I think the blockchain stuff comes in.
Yeah, totally. I remember playing Ultima Online. This was my kind of first massive game. And like, I bought like digital items with like a cashier's check that I would mail.
Yeah, right. Totally. Totally. Yeah.
And then I sold my EverQuest character on eBay.
Totally. Yeah. And like, you're not supposed to, but also you got to do it. Yeah. Totally. Yeah. And it's from a games industry perspective, that's it's both a problem and an opportunity, right? Like any popular game, you end up with these black and gray markets, which is like a problem to deal with. There's also a problem because like, even if you wanted to embrace those things, actually you're like squarely in the territory. Like if you embraced it, you're squarely in the territory of money transmission, and like, you have games are global. And so you're actually commuting value around the world. And so it's really hard to build like a system actually where you can go back and audit transactions or, see all the ins and outs. And so it's actually part of what blockchains help, make easier as well over time. And then the opportunity is like, games today, like players today spend about $200 billion a year in games. And most of that is on like IAPs, in-app purchases and virtual goods. And, those are pure expenditures today. Like it's just people taking money out of their wallet and like knowing that they're not going to get it back most likely. And so it's like a pure entertainment expenditure. And from a developer perspective, like it's great. The games industry has grown a lot. It's pretty big. It's, $200 billion a year, a couple trillion in market cap. But they sort of only have one way to make money today, which is to merchandise those goods and like get to pure expenditures. The cool thing about blockchains and blockchain gaming is it opens up all kinds of new revenue streams for developers where they can kind of shift from being like just a merchant to more like having a little virtual world, introduce player ownership and like property rights for digital goods and currencies. And they can start to be more like, a central bank almost in their virtual worlds, and, have all kinds of, fiscal policies as players, trade with each other and generate income. They can have all kinds of monetary policies and, trading fees and the like, and just open up new revenue streams and new like sources of value too, like, asset value and the like. So yeah, like on the one hand, it's just better for players to be able to own things, and everybody wants to do it. And if you're willing to spend $50 in a game where, it's that $50 is a pure entertainment expenditure, you might be willing to spend more or spend the 50 more easily if you could resell the stuff you bought and recoup some of your costs, or maybe you put some work into it. You use, the thing you bought to overcome a big challenge or a boss in the game, and it levels up, and now it's more rare, and you could sell it actually for a profit. Players will spend even more, that way. So it's like fundamentally better for players. And then there's like a much bigger opportunity space for developers. So I think that's why we're starting to see really just this year, like the idea start to catch wind in the games industry in a pretty big way.
Do you think the like what we see in like these Euro games now, like Axie, like it is purely financial with a bit of gaming?
Right.
Do you think that's going to shift more towards kind of balance?
Yeah, I think so. I hope so. Like, I think, Axie and games like that are super cool. Like they're super innovative. They sort of proved out what a lot of people have talked about for a while in terms of like what's possible in blockchain gaming, right? In terms of like the potential market size and growth and whatever,
Yeah.
all that. But I do think like at the end of the day, what will matter, let's say that becomes like more commonplace. Sort of all games let you own things and trade things, and there's a marketplace, and, some assets have price dynamics, and, whatever, players can trade goods and services. Once that's like commonplace, then what matters is just like, is the game fun? It's like, we're back to games, is the game fun? Is there a good community? Are there ongoing updates, whether that's from like a developer and publisher or a bunch of community members that are enabled to create things in the game? Like that's what will matter and what will be sticky. So yeah, like what we try to focus on in Forte is actually very much the not any of the speculative sort of dynamic, or like, having like tokens early on or whatever. It's really like introducing gameplay and player trading, and then the ability to like create an open market, over time, that's really oriented around the gameplay, and like if you have tokens in a game, having those have like a real use inside of the game. There's a gameplay purpose for them that's not really just tied to like you hope to make a profit on it. It's like you want it for gameplay reasons first and foremost. And then like when you do that, all kinds of stuff will emerge. People will probably create businesses and do whatever in the game, and that's great. But it's not a financial product first; it's a game first, and then it's just got property rights and a market economy that emerges.
Well, like did you play Animal Crossing? Like, because
Yeah.
I like beat the turnip market.
Right. Yeah. Totally. Yeah. Totally. Yeah. Yeah.
So is that like going to be a challenge for game developers, like understanding that can't really happen with with a thing that's worth money.
When there's real money. Yeah,
Yeah.
totally. It is. And it's part of what we spend a lot of time with developers on, sort of like, how do you think about token economies? How do you try to make them sustainable? And like, what is there to learn from traditional economics and market economies? What is there to learn from free to play games, which have pretty complex economies in some ways? And then also, what is there to learn from blockchain and what we've seen in DeFi and some of the cycles in the space? And we think about this will probably take too long to go into in this conversation all today, but like, we really think about economic protocols, which is a term I got from Neil Stephenson in the Diamond Age or whatever. But it's like economic protocols. That's what we think tokens are. And so, how do you design a sustainable economic protocol that thinks about basically, protocols define networks. Who are the network participants? If you're in a game, who are the players? Who are the creators? Who's the community around the game? And like, what contributions do they make to the game? What benefits can they get from the game? And how do you create kind of a sustainable network that way? And so, yeah, it's like a shift in thinking. I think it is a lot for developers to wrap their heads around, but we're starting to see more examples of what might be possible. And even if you look at things like, I don't know, Top Shot, for example, you see like initially sort of NFTs and trading, but now trying to introduce more and more ways to use the NFTs and secondary systems and maybe currencies to like hold value over time. I don't mean hold value in terms of like the monetary value, but like be able to more easily store like fungible value. In a system that started off as just totally oriented around non-fungibles. And so I feel like at equilibrium, all of these systems end up looking pretty similar, and they end up looking a lot like market economies today in the physical world.
Awesome. Yeah. Do you think like the business models for this is going to shift from like game developers kind of expected to sell digital items to actually kind of like getting a portion of the economic activity?
Yeah, I think it kind of shifts from, look, developers will always be able to merchandise, right? Like just be a merchant and sell stuff. So nothing about embracing blockchains and token economies changes that or diminishes it, but it opens up all this new stuff, right? Like basically, you shift from just being a merchant to actually you're a big participant in this market economy, and sort of you're aligned with your players in that, like, actually the more value your players have, the more they trade, even the more like income they make from the way they play the game or the goods and services they trade with other players. Just the bigger your economy gets, and the more revenue streams you as a developer can derive from it, through the protocols you create, the more you're aligned with players in terms of just growing the size of the economy overall. So yeah, I think it will totally change the way that, like, as developers over the next couple of years wrap their heads around that, it will totally change, the way they think about how to manage a game, create a game economy, and participate in it.
What's going to happen with something like people talk about the metaverse, and I almost feel like there isn't like a single metaverse, that we're all kind of building these little pieces together. And like this idea of a multi-chain world, I think is like that's like a boring part of it. Like that's like the layer one base layer. Who cares? It's a database. But like, what about like multi-world world, like the multi-world verse, right? Whatever you want to call it, right? Taking digital items from something like Star Atlas and moving it into like a fantasy world and vice versa.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I mean, I think that will happen, and there's going to be a bunch of different, layers of it. But I think, one way to think about this stuff is that, at the end of the day, it's not necessarily that like every item in a game or application, like every digital asset, will need to be totally interoperable. But at a base layer, like, if you own the things, you can at least transfer the value of that asset around. And then, maybe there's another layer of interoperability that orients around just like the claims that you could make, like I own this thing and I own this thing over here and I can prove it, you know, in some way. And then that enables you to have another instantiation or manifestation of that thing in this other world, you know, that you have. And so I think that's sort of how a lot of metaverse, what people call metaverse, you know, stuff today will manifest. So like an NFT parlance, that would be like, hey, I can prove, you know, I own this particular NFT in game one, you know, that NFT is manifested. The ownership of that NFT, like the game wants to recognize it for whatever reason. They think there's, you know, their players would think it's cool, or there's an economic reason to recognize it. And so, you know, if you can prove that you're the, you know, the account that has that NFT in this game, then you get, you know, some benefit in that game. You know, maybe it manifests as like a player skin or whatever. But in another game, if you can prove that you're, you know, the account that owns that same NFT, it might manifest in a totally different way. Maybe it's sort of a boost or a power up. I think like as people start to think about NFTs and like what you hold in an account as more of like an ownership record or like almost a claims voucher, that's sort of how interoperability will emerge. And you know, there's like early versions of this with projects like Loot, where there's not really like an NFT. It's not a particular picture or a whatever. It's just like I can prove that I'm the one that owns this like set of metadata basically, and like the game will realize that in whatever way it chooses to. And like that's sort of what metaverse stuff will, that's like a baby version of what metaverse stuff will probably look like in the future.
I'm like imagining like in my Star Atlas starship, there's like a sword that's hanging.
Right.
Like, and I want that sword to wear as I'm playing the fantasy game and slaying dragons and seeing the effects of of that now appear in another game.
Totally.
Even if it's all cosmetic, I feel like that immersion will like really kind of like create that like, break that barrier for people. I'm stoked, man. This is like what I was dreaming of as a teenager, playing those like for the first time really playing like massive multiplayer games where you kind of saw the power of the internet and gaming all at the same time.
Totally. Yeah, and it's cool to see even in games where there isn't any direct like real money, how much players do trade and actually how complex the economies get. And you know, there's ways to design that so that you know, it's not very fun for players, like where, you know, you sort of have to grind really hard and then that leads to like gold farming or grind farming or whatever. And sort of like there's a group of people that's willing to just sit there and click on buttons in a game to get paid like less than a minimum wage or livable wage or whatever, but just because it's a way to make a little bit of money. But then there's really cool ways to think about it where actually like, you know, people have more real ownership and, you know, they can do things like, I just want to specialize in I just want to focus on the parts of the game that I really like, and I can trade with other people to, you know, get goods from other parts of the game that, you know, maybe I don't want to focus on as a player. Or like I play with with a big guild, a big group of players, and we sort of, you know, together have this, you know, whatever guild hall that we own, and we can like all upgrade it, and we can all benefit from the upgrades in the game. And like, you know, there's that thing produces goods that other players want, and so, you know, we can sell them into the market and like we all can benefit from that. And it gives us, you know, we already want to play the game and play together because of the game and to overcome challenges, but now like, you know, actually maybe we can earn an income from this thing. And like, you know, over time I think you know, as people's lives are more and more digital around the world, you know, games and blockchain sort of create these ways to have real ownership and to like derive income from all your digital or virtual experiences. And I think, you know, games will be one of the first places that like becomes real at real scale, where you've got players kind of freely trading in this big global economy. And to me, that's just super cool. Like, you know, that possibility over the next few years.
I already see some of this like just emerging from like the simple NFT drops. Like when that thing is really successful, like there's a community that all they do is that they identify by like a PFP on Twitter, and it's like the monkey PFP or whatever, but it becomes its own social network, and it really feels like guilds in like every massive game or every like team game where you can like work together, they're all gonna do this.
Totally, man. Totally. And then what's cool about, and I think game developers are just starting to wrap their heads around this stuff, but by putting this stuff out on a public, distributed ledger, a blockchain, you let people tap into stuff like that. So it's like, cool, I'm part of this guild in whatever, some MMO, and I can actually, because that data sits on an open ledger, I can, other applications can recognize that. So yeah, maybe it manifests as a PFP on Twitter. It's got some metadata with a URL to a PFP version of it. And like, now I can show off that I'm part of this guild and part of that guild and whatever, if I want to, like just opening up the data like that is super, super cool. And like once some games start to do it, it'll be like every game kind of has to do it because it's just so much better for players once you kind of figure it out and make it a good user experience.
Awesome, man.
Yeah. And for us at Forte, like that user experience, that player experience is a big part of what we're trying to solve. Like, onboarding into crypto today, of those 3 billion people that play games, a tiny fraction of them know anything about crypto, let alone care about it deeply or could like keep themselves safe, in the space. So, we try to make it easy to onboard, and that ends up touching like technology. It ends up touching like, new sort of protocol development with like identity and the like. It ends up touching regulation and compliance because, to onboard people and let them trade with each other in many jurisdictions, that ends up being, whether we all like it or not, it ends up being a regulated activity. And so, how can you kind of make all this easy for users to like onboard and, not on one hand have to go through some crazy like, hey, let us teach you about cryptography and, like, here's private keys, don't ever lose them or you're totally fucked, on one hand. And on other hands, also not have to go through like heavy KYC and have no way out to like exiting a trusted or totally centralized system. So like, how do you make that a good player experience and give players like choice? It's a big part of what we've been working on.
Yeah, there's the regulation side is really challenging because I think, in a lot of ways, it's probably what stopped a lot of game developers from adopting stuff like this way earlier.
Totally.
And I'm glad like, blockchain is kind of paving the way there.
Totally. Yeah, like Valve, I know we're almost done, but like Valve has, Counter-Strike Go, and there's like a pretty big skins marketplace for it. And for a minute, Valve like pulled that into their official kind of marketplace and allowed real money transactions. But FinCEN in the US, came and shut them down. It's like, hey, you're like transmitting money. What are you doing? And so they had to turn it all off, And so, yeah, I think game developers know stories like that and sort of, when you have a big game and a player base you care about and revenue you depend on to operate, and like a big franchise, you sort of have to take that stuff seriously. You can't mess around. You're not going to risk your whole business to like experiment with something new, basically. So yeah, we got to synthesize this stuff, like make things self-sovereign and trustless and sit on decentralized ledgers, but like let big businesses that have massive scale play with, use this stuff and take advantage of it, but sort of not shoot themselves in the foot.
Yeah. It really feels like this was like one of the missing pieces for the metaverse.
Yeah.
So I was super excited to just be a part of it, honestly.
Yeah, no doubt, man. Yeah.
Yeah, we're running up to the end of the hour. Like really cool to have you participate and be working with you guys on gaming.
Yeah.
I really feel like this is one of those places where the internet was born out of gaming. Like people going to Facebook and playing Zynga for what it was worth really like created Web 2. And if we can get the same like onboarding for people into crypto, I think it'll be kind of world changing. So
totally, man. Totally. Yeah. And I think even back in the day, like, BBSs and MUDs and stuff, like gaming is kind of there. Yeah. So yeah, it'll be awesome. Yeah. And we're stoked to be working with you guys too. So yeah, thanks for having me on, man. It's fun to talk.
Sure.
Do it again soon.
Sure. All right.
Thanks, folks, man. Okay. Thanks, everybody.
Care.
See ya.